like to introduce today Scott Nicholson, Associate Professor from Syracuse University and Director of the Library Gaming Lab of Syracuse. And he also is both a board game player and board game designer. And he runs a number of different podcasts. There's the Board Games with Scott podcast, which is specifically talking about board games and Scott stuff, which is about everything else. and board games too. He has board games published. We were playing Tulipmania earlier, and a few more in the pipelines, as I understand it. And he'll be talking now about games and libraries, which is a part of the body of research that he's working in. And later on in my class, he'll be talking a little bit about publishing, the sort of publishing of board games in the industry. So, Scott, thank you. Yeah.
So, as Philip mentioned, I work primarily. I've been working in libraries. I was a librarian. My first degree was actually math and computers, and I worked as a computer guy for several years at the University of Oklahoma. And got tired of my hobby being my job, so I became a librarian, where I was able to use computer skills to support doing other stuff. But then I went on, did my PhD, and went to work for Citibank as a statistician. And that was the dark time of my life. Realized I was not a good fit for corporate banking, didn't quite blend there. So joined Syracuse University about 10 years ago. My first research area was actually on data mining and helping libraries to use data mining tools to look at what's going on at the library so they can make better choices for their patrons. A few years ago, I was at an American Library Association conference and saw they had a Dance Dance Revolution mat with some people playing DDR. This was back in 2005. And I looked at it and chatted with the folks who were there and said, well, what's going on with this? And they explained how a lot of libraries were now starting to use video games as a way to bring teenagers into the library. I thought, well, that's interesting. Now, I've been a gamer for 30 years. I grew up, the Atari 2600 was part of it. I really hated it when Nintendo came out with 2 buttons because now I couldn't do that this way. So, and I knew that there was a wide variety of game types out there that could draw in a much wider audience, just like public libraries attract people from cradle to grave. That whole audience. Gaming does too. And there's actually games that can extend way beyond just teens and video games. And that's when I decided to get involved and say, all right, well, let's figure out what's going on. So for the last 3 or 4 years, I've been running the Library Game Lab at Syracuse, and a lot of what I've been doing in that time is ethnographic studies, trying to understand why libraries are using games, how they're using games. And so what I'm going to present today is kind of a synopsis of my last 3 to 4 years of work. So we're not going to go too much in depth in any one area, but there are readings and books on all of this stuff. So if you want to go in more in depth, you can do so. In fact, I'll go ahead and start passing this around. This is a book that came out earlier this year, Everyone Plays in the Library. That's a culmination of a lot of this work. It's designed more for librarians, but it's based on a conceptual model for the gaming experience that I'll present here. But I'll pass that around so you can see what's up with that. So what I'm going to talk about is the past, sort of what's happened, about gaming in libraries over the past. I'm going to talk about the results from our studies so that you get a better idea of how games are used in libraries today. And then I'm going to present this model of game experiences that I've created and talk about how I've pitched that to libraries to use. And then talk a little bit about what I'm liking, what I'm thinking about doing in the future, my next step, which is actually what's brought me here today to talk with a number of different folks at MIT about what I'm interested in exploring. So first I'll talk a little bit about the past. So I'm going to break the past down into 2 things, one of which you may have expected, one of which may be new to you. So I'm going to talk about games as collections. So that in that case, it's the library collecting a set of games, just like you have a game library here. The library building a set of games for a user base, and that's probably what a lot of people would think about when they think about libraries having games, is they have a collection of games that people can check out and take home. And some libraries do. But then we're going to talk about then what I've looked more at, and that's gaming as a service, that you actually go to a library to play games. And you do it at a time to engage with other people. And that's what has been interesting to study, and has gotten me more engaged with what's going on with libraries and games. There's 3 different ways that libraries have collections. And again, what you may expect, in academic libraries, there are collections of games being built to support game design and game creation curriculum. Academic libraries that are supporting that are being tapped to provide, here again you have a library for your students, but a lot of places don't have that, and they're turning to the library to say, we need some help building up a basic collection of different types of games so our students in game design can be supported. Special collections is an area within many libraries that is a smaller subset that's in depth in an area. Many times these start by a gift. So someone dies, they bequeath the library their card collection. And then the library says, oh, now we have a strength in playing cards. Let's collect a lot more types of playing cards. Let's collect a checkers collection. So there's more board game, video game, and traditional game collections coming up in libraries. And I suspect, I hypothesize, this is going to grow as more of us get old and die. Because those of us that have collected games for 30 plus years, we have these collections. Like, well, what are we going to do with them? Well, when we pass away, we'll bequeath them to a library, and some libraries will take that as the start of a special collection. So I'm predicting we're going to see a continued growth in the number of special libraries out there that have gaming collections that start that way. They start with a gift. In schools, more schools are buying games to support classroom use. So school libraries, what they do in a school library is they are aware of what teachers are trying to teach, and the school librarian helps the teachers to find educational resources. So traditionally, that's been books, it's been videos, it's been computer use and computer programs for some time. And we're seeing more and more work now in games. There's a group in the western part of New York that actually are tying in recreational board games to specific New York State learning standards. So a teacher in New York State can look at the learning standard they're trying to teach. They've written a book called Libraries Got Game on the topic. And you can look at that and see, oh, well, for this you could use the board game called Power Grid. And here's what it will teach, here's how to use it, here's what the takeaway is from that. And so there's been a growth in school libraries. Now, another way school libraries are using games is gaming as a service, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Right now I'm really focusing on the building up of a collection. There's another type of library which you may not have heard of, toy and game libraries. So the first toy library actually started in 1935 in Los Angeles. And like many libraries actually started with someone who had a collection or a lot of money who wanted to put something together to benefit people in their community that they felt were less well off. And that's how in 1935 a fellow started a toy library in Los Angeles so that kids who didn't have a lot of money, because times were tough at that point, would be able to have access to toys. And it was kind of quiet for a while, but until the 1960s there was a program called Head Start. And that really began a growth of toy and game libraries, where parents could go to a library to check out toys and games for their kids. There is an association now, the International Toy Library Association, helps coordinate this. There's several thousand toy and game libraries right now in the United States. Many of them are affiliated with public libraries. Some of them aren't. Some of them are just on their own toy and game libraries. So that's again a way of circulating toys and games. We've seen some growth of circulation of electronic games. So in 1982, I found an article where they talked about libraries circulating Atari 2600 cartridges. And so at that point, we had some libraries starting to circulate games. Today, and this is one of the studies we did, was a census where we randomly selected 400 public libraries from the United States, contacted them all, and talked to them about how they do gaming. So some of the data you see is coming from this census where we wanted to get some pretty reasonable data. So some of these statistics, if I give like a number like this, it's actually plus or minus 5% because of the sample size that we had. So around 20% of public libraries today circulate games. It's about 1 in 5. Some of them are pretty big. Baltimore County Public has 5,000 video games that they're circulating. So we're seeing a growth in circulation of games. But what's more interesting and what got me more excited was gaming as a service. So this is moving away from games as objects, games as information-bearing objects, to gaming as an activity that you do in the library. And I found 2 mentions of gaming in libraries in the 1850s. First one is in San Francisco. The oldest chess club in the US that still meets today was founded in a library in San Francisco, and it still meets at that library today. Now the library has actually moved several times, but the chess club has stayed with them. Having the chess room in the library has been part of what's going on. Now you need to understand at this point, libraries, as I mentioned earlier, existed because groups of wealthy individuals got together to put together a library for the betterment of their community. Because of that, libraries at this point also were more places to improve your morality. That it was put together because a group of people said, well, these people down here, they don't have good enough morals. We need to give them reading materials to help them improve their life, to help them live more morally. And the librarian in that role was more of a pharmacist that would assign books to you based upon what you needed to do to improve your life, to live a better life. You still see little traces of that in public libraries at times. We give them, it's this debate, you give people what it is they want, or do you give people what it is that they should have? You know, do you give them Huckleberry Finn, or do you give them Harry Potter? Now, many public libraries today have said, you know, we give up, we're going to give them what they want. But that actually got its grounding in these libraries in the 1800s, which were these moral spaces. In the UK at this time, libraries, there were some libraries that had built smoking parlors and pool halls within the public library because the idea was to lure people away from the public houses, to get them out of the bars and the taverns, to come to a place where they can have good quality recreation outside of the loose women and the loose alcohol. So we found other tidbits about library as a service. In 1942, I found a library article journal where they talked about how libraries can support recreation and supporting that through games. And at this point, we're talking about board games, we're talking about chess, we're talking about things like that, cards, and other sorts of games and amusements, parlor amusements. 1966 was when the first time I found a discussion about using games to bring in new patrons. So one example was working with a boys club where they used games to help older kids work with younger kids. And they play games together. Games were not always welcome in libraries. They still aren't in some libraries. There's some policies that prohibit games. So for example, when I did I've also done, along with that big census, I did a yearly census that was a convenience sample that I put out on the web asking libraries to tell me about their gaming. And what I found is that there were a number of school media libraries that had rules that said they couldn't use games, but they were using them anyway. And we're at a point now where a lot of libraries don't have policies or may even have policies prohibiting gaming, but they're doing it anyway, and they're trying to figure out how to change the policies. In 1992, there was a story in New Rochelle where a chess player was playing chess, and the librarians asked him to stop playing chess. So he went and got a book on chess and kept the chessboard out and was using it to just work through some of the chess puzzles. And they called the police and had him thrown out. So not all libraries are in open arms with gaming, but more and more are becoming that way as they're recognizing the importance that gaming has in our society now. Libraries have had other game types throughout the years. If you search around, you'll find at many libraries there are meetings of Scrabble clubs and chess clubs, mahjong clubs, bridge clubs. These clubs are using the library as a public space to engage. We've seen a push with Dungeons and Dragons over the years, and interesting enough, Wizards of the Coast has actually helped with getting engagement in libraries. They have a library program that they will send libraries Dungeons and Dragons stuff, Magic the Gathering stuff, and help the library become a place that's actually registered on their site where you can go and play D&D. What's interesting, and I'll talk about this later on when I talk about my model, is role-playing games are very interesting connections for libraries because they're one of the few really legitimate literacy connections. If the role of the library is to improve literacy, role-playing games, face-to-face role-playing games, have a pretty heavy literacy component. There's a lot of reading and work you're going to do. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Summer reading programs are one of the most popular programs in libraries, and many of those are based upon some kind of game. You know, we talk about how there's the gamification now and the pointification now, but how many of you did a summer reading program as kids where you counted the books that you read and you got achievements for, so we've been at this for a while, you know, a lot of librarians don't recognize they've been using games and game models for a long time, but it's something that we did. The Wii is a popular thing now for intergenerational gaming. We're finding that seniors and teens can play games together with the Wii, but actually, 1943, there was the Golden Age program, the idea of bringing your seniors into the library to have them teach games from their childhood to other library patrons. And so I've continued to see emphasis on using games of different types as a way of bringing in different generations together. We've seen digital games in libraries for some time. 1979, you know, as the first computers, the PET computers entering the libraries, games were a way that people got comfortable with computing. If you worked with computers at that point, you know many times, even when you move into Windows, you know the way you would get people used to a mouse is having them play with solitaire. And the libraries used that as well. Many libraries had certain types of games. In the 1990s, a lot of them had CD-ROM games. You remember all the multimedia CD-ROM game world. But the video game space is growing pretty wildly in libraries. A lot of libraries now have Wiis. There's about 9,200 catalog computer games that have a catalog record in WorldCat, which is this shared catalog. And so we're seeing more and more interest. The other thing that's changed in the last 2 years is more of the library vendors are now supplying games to libraries. Because one of the challenges that a library has is to purchase stuff. If they don't purchase it outside of one of their cleared vendor channels, it's a bit of a hassle. And so now, actually, part of what I've been doing is working with the vendors to help coach them on here's the sort of stuff you might want to carry. And so many of the vendors now, if you go to ALA, you'll now see a number of booths that have different types of Wiis, different types of dance pads. I actually worked with some of the library suppliers to have them create a Wii Station with lanyard remotes, because that was a challenge as the Wiimotes were walking away. And so now the librarians, if they want to put a Wii Station in, they can get one with, which is kind of funny, you're taking away the whole idea of the Wiimote, the wireless Wiimote, and putting a wire on there. But when you're facilitating games, and that's what I'm going to be talking a lot about, the libraries are facilitating game experiences, you have to think about those sort of things like security, because it's not a home environment. So you have to worry about that stuff walking away. So most of the things that I mentioned still continue today in some form. The concept here is that libraries, many libraries support recreation. There's an event coming up on Saturday that you may not know about, National Gaming Day at your library. This is the third National Gaming Day at your library that's gone on. Last year, over 30,000 people played games in libraries on National Gaming Day at your library. This year, we already have about 3 times as many libraries that have signed up for the event. So we're expecting the number of players to just shoot through the roof. What I have been doing in sort of my research along these lines is helping that assessment piece, helping libraries to collect data that we can all gather together so we can say, you know, the first year was about 16,000 people played. Last year we had 30,000 people play. So when we've had actually support from Hasbro, we've had support from some of the big board game companies. Last year Hasbro actually sent a board game, the same board game to every library, every public library in the US. They paid all the shipping, you know, and I made a video to teach people how to play it. So if you actually search online, you might find that there's a library near you that's going to be doing gaming on Saturday. And you could go down and see what they're up to. So that's the idea, is to get as many people going to libraries to play games at the same day. But why? Why does it fit in? Now this was actually that first meeting where I played Dance Dance Revolution at the American Library Association. This person, Jenny Levine, she's a librarian, she works for the American Library Association, and she works a lot in gaming in libraries. So this was actually akin to like playing golf. You know, I was able to earn a little street cred because I could keep up with her in DDR. And then we were able to talk about gaming, and she realized that I was just not some nonsense professor. I was a nonsense professor that could jump around on a dance mat. But you know, we were doing an interview with the New York Times about games and libraries, and the big question people ask, why games and libraries? What do games have to do with libraries? Now in this audience, I probably don't have to go into all of this, but this is the typical answer that I give. So this picture is a little dark, but we can make it out. So what we have here in libraries, this is a typical story time activity. One of the biggest programs in public libraries is story time. Story time is where the kids come together, someone reads a story. The parents come together as well. So this is a story time activity. So you got the kids sitting on the floor. We've got, now this is a cowboy who's yelling and screaming and hooping and hollering. Story time is not a quiet little activity, and it's not really about what book is being read. It's about a social experience. The kids are getting together, they're getting engaged in a story. The parents come along, and the parents chat. And the parents engage with each other. So story time is not just about kids getting a story read to them. It's about a time when people come together and engage with each other. Gaming is story time for the rest of us. Most games have you engage in a story world in some sort. It may not be a very deep story, you know, you're on stage dancing on a dance mat. But there is some sort of story that you're engaging with, and you're telling the end of that story. So gaming is really an extension. When the kids get too old for story time, you then transition them into gaming programs. And that's what's going on in libraries. You get the same thing. The kids come, they're engaged with each other with the games. Parents come, they're engaged with each other, and if you've selected games well, you can have games they're engaged with as well. So they're just not sitting around. Now, some of our studies, and I'll show you this a little bit later, indicated that 10% of the libraries said someone complained about having games in the library. That was an outcome of having games in the library. And that's shown in this picture. There's this guy here reading the paper, just wishing this stupid cowboy would stop running around. And so we see that there's always going to be someone complaining. But this is also another thing that's got more and more popular in libraries. Cafes. What does coffee have to do with a library? What's the connection there? You know, again, it's this space, it's a service that's related to the other stuff a library is doing. But it's this social space, and that's what libraries are doing. And so gaming is really just another relevant service for libraries. It's something that they're doing. So if you have to talk to a librarian about why games, there's some words to use to compare it to story time, to compare it to cafes. It's a social activity that gets people engaged. Now let me talk a little bit about the results of those studies that I did, so you can understand what's going on with games in libraries. So I've given you a picture of the past, but I can actually give you a little bit of the data. So from our data, we found about 75% of public libraries support gaming in some way. Now that could be they allow people to play games on the library computers. That was a pretty big one, that they don't prohibit that, they don't have policies against it. And many libraries have chess boards, checkers boards, Scrabble boards, and many a times this is related to summer reading or the kids section. But right now, about 75% support gaming in some way. And about 80% said that they allow patrons to play games on library computers, which is interesting in that 5% of the people who took this study then said, yes, we let people play games on the library computers, but we don't support gaming. A lot of what I've been doing in the last 3 to 4 years is really evangelism. I've been giving talks like this actually all over the country, talking to librarians saying, you do gaming, you have done gaming for a long time, you've got the games already, don't be afraid of it, now embrace it and extend it. It's already in your library, this is not something new. That's one of the big statements I like to get people realizing they can do it. About 40% of libraries run formalized gaming programs, where they have a time, come here and play games. So it's a pretty interesting way if you want to get engaged with your local libraries. See if they're running a gaming program.
Are those regular or just they have done those?
They have done those. But what I find is actually once a library starts, and I'll show this data a little later, once a library starts running gaming programs, on average they run them 14 times a year.
Okay.
And again, that's from our census that we do. Once they get it, once they start it, once they see who's walking in the door that hasn't been there in a long time, they realize, hey, this is significant. So that's why the National Gaming Day we started 3 years ago, to say, try it once. See who comes in that you've never seen. See what kind of buzz it creates. And that's gotten more and more of these things launched. As I mentioned earlier, about 20% circulate games. And we also found, just in general, the larger the library, the more likely they are to have some sort of gaming activities. And that's tied into funding issues. And I'll talk a little bit about how libraries justify this later. We also asked some questions about gaming programs. So now we drilled down to say, all right, if you run a program, tell us about it. Only about 10% of the time did the library say it was an educational program. 90% of the time, it's a recreational activity. Now school libraries were much higher. And in fact, school libraries, I'll talk about the most common programs in each of these library types. So public libraries, the most common library gaming program is targeting teens, come to the library at a certain time, play games with each other. And it may be a tournament or may not. We found about half the time they were tournament-based, about half the time they were open play. What we find in many libraries, because a lot of libraries are realizing that they're supplying access to games to kids who can't afford games. That's what one part of what libraries do more and more. They provide access to technologies to help kids become savvy in what's going on so they can have conversations with other kids about certain types of games. And so in environments where they're supplying access to people that don't have them at home, the open play events work better. And when they're in an environment where everyone has Rock Band, then a Rock Band tournament works better. Because people want to come and show off. They want to show off their skills on a big screen. So and many libraries will move. They'll start out with open play, and then months later they'll move into having a tournament. In school libraries, there's two ways they tend to use gaming. One is, as I talked earlier, aligned with the curriculum. So you're trying to learn something, you want to teach them a game. The second way is an at-lunch or an after-school program. Because I've heard a number of libraries that talk about the fact that the gaming program as an extracurricular activity draws out those kids who may have a hard time socially engaging with other kids in any other way. But creating a game space makes a safe space for them to be geeks. I actually was reflecting upon this. I grew up in rural Oklahoma. I went to the same school for my entire K through 12 in this town of 1,200 people. But I remember in the high school library going with 2 other kids and we played King's Quest on the computers and worked our way through King's Quest during lunch. And it dawned on me, hey, that librarian got it. They didn't have to let us be in there being noisy as we're working our way through these adventures, but she realized this for us was a really important social time where we really couldn't be that way anywhere else, that it was okay to be ourselves. And I've heard many school libraries talk about what the power of having a gaming group does for that class of kids, that group of kids that just don't feel comfortable being alone or being over there in the corner with their DS as compared to bringing them all in, having them sit staring at the screen at their DS together. But there still is engagement that then goes on, when they are next to each other as compared to being scattered around the playground.